Welcome to Whitestone Missionary Baptist Church, 187 South Parkway East, for our Sunday School lesson presentation this week. We're in the spring quarter course. This is lesson 164 in this particular live streaming series. It's the 10th one for the summer quarter. The subject for this week is forgiving one another. The Bible text where that subject is taken from is Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 through 35. The theme for the book of Matthew, or the Gospel of Matthew, we see where Christ is presented as king by the writer. And the theme for August 6th, the first Sunday today, all the way through the fourth Sunday in this month, is entering God's kingdom. Now, I'm sorry I said that wrong. The theme for this week, which began on the first Sunday in July, is responding to God's kingdom. And the theme for next Sunday through the end of the month is entering God's kingdom. The quarter theme is Christ proclaims the kingdom. The golden text is verses 32 and 33. And I'll just read it. Then his Lord, after he had called him, said unto him, O thou wicked servant, I forgave thee all that debt, because thou desirest me. Shouldn't you also have had compassion on thy fellow servant, even as I had pity on you? Now, the chief commentator is Keith E. Eggert. And he said this on page 135 of our adult expositor. He said, the master confronted his servant, the man that he had forgiven for all the debt, because the man begged him so. And by calling him wicked and reminded him of the great debt he had forgiven him. Barnhart, another one of our commentators on page 139, said this: as believers in Christ in this 21st century, we are to demonstrate the love of God in our lives by extending mercy and forgiveness to others. Now, the lesson is divided into two sections. Section 1, the servant forgiven. Section 2, the servant unforgiving. The first servant in the text was forgiven because he begged the Lord and pleaded with him. The same man that was forgiven all his debt, when he saw the other man that owed him, he wanted to kill the man. Eggert made 7 key points on page 131. I'll just mention 3. Number 1, many people find it hard to forgive others. Perhaps it is because of the have it your way philosophy of the culture we live in. And then the second point I want to mention, the principle of forgiveness is one of the most rewarding. And the 7th point, and this is the 3rd point that I will mention out of the 7. The essence of forgiveness is unwillingness not to get even with someone who has hurt us. And it's hard. But in Christ we can do it. This is precisely what Jesus is teaching us this week. Now the key words, I just want to mention a few of them. Teach. That's a word that people use all the time, but teach means to show or explain to people how to do something. And that's what Jesus precisely is doing in the text. Releasing. The first servant begged the Lord to forgive him, begged his master to forgive him for the debt he owed. He said he needed more time. So the man just forgave him all the debt, said, you don't owe me anymore. You don't owe anything. I cleared your debt. That means, releasing means to allow or enable one to escape, to set him free. He set him free from all his debt. All right, compassion. That's a key word in our lesson text. Compassion means sympathetic toward others, pity and concern for the suffering of somebody else. Forgiving, allowing room for error or weakness. In other words, we're willing to forgive a person. We're willing to tell the person, I excuse you for the hurt that you've done. And you notice the Lord the master in the text called the servant, that same servant, called him wicked. Means he was evil and morally wrong because he did not extend the same mercy and forgiveness that he had received from his master. Now there are 10 questions on page 135, and I will attempt to point out at least 5 that I think is really important that drives the lesson home to us. Number 1, what had caused Peter to wonder about how often to forgive? Well, as Christ was teaching the importance of forgiving one another, Peter had a logical follow-up question. Well, it's only natural that he wanted a clear understanding of it because Jesus said, forgive them. And so the second question follows up that. He says, how do we know his concern was about fellow believers? Well, it's very simple. In the verse 21, he said, how many times should I forgive my brother? How many times should I forgive my fellow Christian? How many times shall I forgive my brother of faith? How many times shall I give another person? Then the third point, how did Jesus respond to Peter's seemingly generous offer to forgive 7 times? Well, what did he mean? Christ's answer did not mean we should count up to 490 offenses. Okay, now I've forgiven you 490 times. I'm not going to do it anymore. If God did that on us, counted all the forgivenesses that he's done for us in our life, we would have exceeded. At least I would have. God is unlimited in his mercy, but there's a time it'll catch up with you. He was teaching that forgiveness should go on endlessly, no matter how many times we are offended. All right, here's a question number 6, for example. What did the servant do after being forgiven, and what did this reveal about him? He took him by the throat, apparently choking him and demanding payment of what was owed him. Just as this man had done before the king, his fellow servant fell down before him, pleading for time and promising to pay everything. Everything the first servant did indicated a completely merciless attitude, difficult to understand in light of the mercy he had just received. See, God forgives us all every day. And I've watched this all my life. Some people are very hard on people who do the same thing that they did, and when they were in that predicament, they beg for mercy. And see, we all need God's forgiveness because we all sin. Well, number 10, what is the practical, or what is the practical way in which we can apply the parable? The parable is a short story used to illustrate a spiritual message from God or from Christ to us. Just take to heart what Paul said in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32. Well, this would be a good time for each of us to examine our heart and be certain that there's no spirit of bitterness or unwillingness to forgive. See, if we're walking around, we're getting up every morning with bitterness in our hearts and unwillingness to forgive, we have failed to remember Christ committed the greatest act of forgiveness to mankind when he died in our places on the cross. This is especially important if there has been a long-standing hurt or grudge from which we need emotional and spiritual healing. We can't heal, we can't grow in Christ if we're still holding in our hearts or some bitterness for somebody what they did 40, 50, 60 years ago when we were 10 years old. Shimura presents age group emphasis. As more mature Christians, and a mature Christian can be 10, can be 15, can be 45, can be 75 or 95. Immature Christians can be any age. For children, that's ages maybe 2.5 up to about 8 or 9. As teachers and as more mature Christians or believers in Christ, we can use this spiritual truth from this lesson, this parable, to help young students or immature Christians to know that God has given us all the ability to treat others the same way as God has treated us. Now, as for youth, those say 10, 11, up to about 18 or 12 or 19, let us teach them, let us who are more mature and who have grown a little further, teach the youth that God's awesome forgiveness frees them to forgive others and experience a life of abounding joy. You can't have real joy in your life if you're mad with somebody. I found that to be true. You can't. Now, as adults, thus 21 and up, let us help each other, all of us. Let us help each other to free ourselves from emotional bondage, which I just got through explaining. It's bad for youth, it's bad for children to grow up holding grudges against one another. And I've seen it happen. Embrace Christ's forgiveness and forgiving others. It will free us to delight in the Lord as never before. Now, the point that stuck out to me more than anything else in the whole lesson, from the beginning to the end, God is holy and we are unholy and sinful. You can look, you can search, but you'll never find God sinful. But you can never find a human that hadn't sinned. God bless you, and I hope that you would join us in morning worship later on today.